iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome to another edition of iGlobenews Pods. Please remember to like and subscribe to our social media pages. All our podcasts, including this one, can be found on www.iglobenews.org. Please visit our YouTube channel and sign up for our newsletter to become part of the iGlobenews community. The topic of today's interview is the current situation in Ukraine, which I will be discussing with Professor Gerhard Mangott, internationally renowned scholar and expert on Russia, Ukraine, arms control proliferation, as well as the European Union's energy security in the oil and gas sector. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Mangott.
Hello.
The fighting in Ukraine is entering its third week. Russia and Ukraine are set to continue their talks. Up to now, each side was not willing to give an inch. Today, Foreign Minister Lavrov indicated that there might be room for negotiations. The same signal has come from Ukraine. President Zelensky has indicated that Ukraine will not join NATO. The positions of each side might be in the process of softening up. Previously, Russia had insisted on the demilitarization of Ukraine, the recognition of Crimea and Donbass as independent, and a neutral Ukraine. Ukraine, on the other hand, has demanded the complete withdrawal of all Russian troops and an end to the military operation. You have mentioned previously that if Ukraine does not politically capitulate, Russia will continue its operation until the complete military capitulation of Ukraine. In your opinion, can this conflict be ended? And if so, is the solution to this crisis between Russia and Ukraine a neutral Ukraine? Are both sides becoming more flexible?
Well, we had the positive statements by Lavrov and the Ukrainian side yesterday and today. You just mentioned it. But on the other hand, yesterday, Vladimir Putin himself said that Ukraine is not negotiating seriously. So we have some contradicting information from the Russian side, and it's difficult to say what is really negotiated between the Ukrainian and the Russian delegation. You've indicated the Russian demands, you have indicated the Ukrainian demands. So these demands are very far apart from each other. So a convergence on a compromise solution does not look very likely. I don't think that Russia is now in a position where it wants to compromise on its demands. Maybe on the issue of Crimea, maybe Russia will not ask or demand from Ukraine that they recognize Crimea and Sevastopol as parts of Russia, because this would not actually alter very much for the Russian side. The Western countries would still not recognize that Crimea is part of Russia. But on the other two issues, the neutrality of Ukraine in a demilitarized manner and the recognition of the separatist republics in the Donbass is non-negotiable for Russia. If it were to negotiate on it, actually, this would mean that the question should be asked, what was the war decision good for? What has Russia actually achieved with this decision to wage a war of aggression? The problem from the Ukrainian side is that even if Zelensky is going to accept neutrality as the new security status of Ukraine, he's demanding security guarantees for such a new status. Of course, he doesn't speak about security guarantees from the Russian Federation. We know that they are not worth the paper they've been written on. But he will ask for security guarantees from Western countries, particularly the United States, the UK, France, and Germany. Well, this sounds quite an easy task to achieve, but it isn't, because if he really insists on strong security guarantees by these countries for Ukraine's political independence and territorial integrity, this would mean that he would ask for an Article 5 NATO collective defense commitment from the back door. He would actually get what he would have got as a member of the NATO alliance, and I'm not very sure that the Western countries are willing to make such a commitment, or if they do, that they would live up to such a commitment in case of a renewed attack on Ukraine. And finally, if Zelensky accepts the status of neutrality, it is not sure whether he will be able to implement such a decision in Ukraine, whether he'll get a majority support by the political elite of the country, so he could endanger his position as president if he goes too far in compromising with the Russian side.
One follow-up question to that question. Many Western European countries who have been neutral for a long time, including Austria, have close connections to NATO, like NATO partnerships. So this Russia would definitely, in your opinion, accept or not accept in case Ukraine would become a neutral country?
No, definitely not. Any cooperation with NATO, military cooperation in terms of training and advice, weaponry, and joint military exercises would be unacceptable for the Russian side. If they'd accept this, even after this war or at the end of this war, then actually they would not have gained very much. So neutral status actually means that the sovereignty of Ukraine is limited. Its foreign policy room for maneuvering is limited, and it is actually obliged to have benevolent foreign policy towards Russia. So any cooperation with NATO would be off the table if the Russians actually prevail with their demands. What the Russian side is currently trying to achieve is the political capitulation of the Ukrainian government. If they will not achieve that, meaning that Zelensky will not accept the demands that Russia is currently put on the table, the war will go on. It will escalate even further. It will be brutalized with more attacks on civilian infrastructure for the goal or for the objective of the Russian side to achieve the military capitulation of the Ukrainian government and the military.
Thank you for your opinion on this very important topic. I wanted to turn now to the lead up to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. In 1998, George Kennan remarked that NATO's eastward expansion is a tragic mistake, yet NATO continued to expand to the borders of Russia. Russia has continuously referred to the principle of the indivisibility of security and how the US NATO has not taken Russia's security interests into account. If the US NATO had taken these security interests of the Russian Federation more seriously, could this war in Ukraine have been avoided? And with the wisdom of hindsight, why did diplomacy regarding the Russia-Ukraine crisis fail?
Well, actually, the promise of membership for Ukraine and Georgia made at the NATO summit in Bucharest in April 2008 was a terrible mistake. This definitely crossed the red lines defined by Vladimir Putin already in 2007 when he addressed the Munich Security Conference. So that was a terrible mistake. And of course, since then, Ukraine had no option to join NATO. It doesn't even have a membership action plan leading it up to NATO membership. And a NATO invitation for Ukraine to join was not on the table, as some countries in the European Union, particularly France and Germany, are opposed to the membership of Ukraine in NATO. So actually, the threat of Ukrainian membership in NATO is not something currently on the agenda, not on the agenda for the foreseeable future. So why did Russia still bring up this issue? Well, Russia, or the Putin leadership, has redefined its red line over Ukraine in the past fall. Previously, the red line was no membership of Ukraine in NATO, but the newly defined red line is no military cooperation between NATO and Ukraine, which has intensified considerably over the past years. Well, if negotiations could have prevented the war, it's difficult to say, but I do argue that probably the West was not flexible, not creative enough in the negotiations with the Russian side in late December and January and early February of this year. I mean, what I'm criticizing the West about is not trying to find out if a negotiated neutral status for Ukraine would be sufficient for Russia and would have prevented this war of aggression. Because, as I argue, the US government was very, very sure that Putin will launch this war. So they were expecting this war. At the same time, the United States and most other NATO countries said that they will not support Ukraine militarily, in the sense that NATO member states sent their own soldiers to Ukraine to help them fight against the Russian invaders. And thirdly, almost every military expert said that Ukraine will ultimately lose this war. So in the past weeks and months, it was clear that Ukraine will become the victim of Russian aggression. So everybody expected that. But at the same time, NATO defended the principle of the freedom of choice, which alliances countries may join. And it defended its principle of the open door, meaning that every country which fulfills the criteria is allowed to join NATO. While at the same time, it was clear that NATO would not expect Ukraine as a member for the next 10 to 15 years. So the West decided to defend an abstract principle, this open door policy, and the freedom of alliance, while they were expecting Ukraine to become a victim, and while they were talking openly about the fact that they would not support Ukraine and are not thinking about accepting Ukraine as a member. So actually, I have argued during negotiations, and I still argue, the West should have talked to the Russian side about the neutral status of Ukraine, which, of course, Ukraine at that time completely rejected. And maybe the neutral status of Ukraine would have been to imposed on Ukraine. It's not sure that Putin would have accepted this, would have been satisfied with it. We don't know. Maybe he, from the very start, planned this war of aggression. But if the Western side had talked with the Russian side openly about the neutral status, we now would know if that compromise would have satisfied the Russian side, or if Russia in any case would have targeted Ukraine, because aggression is not only about the status of Ukraine as a potential NATO member, but it is more part of a historically visionist policy of Vladimir Putin and his cronies to bring back Ukraine into the orbit of the Russian Federation. So we could have tried, we should have tried, with no guarantee that this would have prevented the war, but we didn't even try.
So opportunities were lost, which might have saved many lives. But now we find ourselves in this horrible situation, in this war. I'd like to turn to the whole discussion of the no-fly zone over Ukraine. President Zelensky is pushing for the US NATO to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. This would effectively mean expanding the war and involving a direct confrontation between US, NATO, and Russia. The US and most NATO allies have refused to do this, but some in the EU, such as Poland and the Baltic countries, are seriously considering this possibility. Estonia has come out in support of a no-fly zone. If in the future the US, NATO change their position on the no-fly zone, will the world be faced with World War III, and what are the possibilities that such an escalation could happen?
At first sight, a no-fly zone over Ukraine looks like something very easily to be done. But if you establish a no-fly zone, that means that NATO aircraft has to enter the Ukrainian airspace and prevent Russian aircraft to use the Ukrainian airspace, which would ultimately mean that NATO would have to be ready to get Russian aircraft down by missiles and the like. So this would, of course, start a direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia. And neither Russia nor NATO have escalation control if such a conflict emerges. And it could well include nuclear escalation from the Russian side. Most Western military experts argue that it's part of the Russian military, the concept of escalating to de-escalate is part of the Russian military doctrine, which means that if Russia is facing defeat in a conventional war, Russia is ready to use sub-strategic tactical nuclear weapons to stop the conventional war. So if this perception of the Russian military doctrine's content is correct, then a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia would include the threat of nuclear escalation. And it's absolutely unclear if such a situation could then be controlled or would actually escalate into an all-out thermonuclear global war, which would mean the end for all of us. So a no-fly zone, as supported by Eastern European member states, is highly irresponsible and very, very risky. So it should not be established. And I don't think that NATO will come to this conclusion, even if the war rages on for the next weeks and months, because this would be a red line that many NATO members don't want to cross, and that's a good thing to do. Delivering weapons, however, to Ukraine is, of course, a sound policy if, and that's the big if Western military experts are correct when they argue with this military weapons deliveries from the Western side, Ukraine could possibly prevent Russia from winning this war. It could probably withstand the Russian aggression. If that is correct, yes, then weapons deliveries are a very good step to take or to have been taken. But if they are wrong, and the majority of military experts is right that argue that ultimately Russia will win such a war against Ukraine, then we should rethink this policy of weapons deliveries, because then weapons deliveries would only prolong the war, cause additional casualties, but would not ultimately prevent a military defeat of the Ukrainian side.
And there have been reports that Western weapons have fallen into the hands of the Russian army, which would mean you're actually only arming the other side by continuing these military weapons deliveries. Yesterday, the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovenia traveled to Kiev in show of support for Ukraine. Will this change the US-NATO stance on the no-fly zone?
Not at all. This will have no influence. Actually, many countries in the European Union are not only skeptical about this trip to Kiev by these three prime ministers, but they are annoyed because it puts pressure on the other European governments to do the same. Well, if the Polish, the Czech, and the Slovenians are ready and brave enough to go to Kiev while Kiev is under military assault, then this should be done by other European prime ministers or presidents as well. And many of them don't like being forced or pressured to do the same as the Eastern Europeans. However, this will not in any way change the position of the major Western powers inside NATO. So on the emergency summit of NATO on March the 24th, where Joseph Biden most likely will be part of the club, will not result in revising decision not to establish a no-fly zone. And it will most likely not revise the US position that NATO countries should not hand over their military aircraft to Ukraine to improve its air fighting capacity confronted with the Russian Air Force. Actually, it's not only very risky, because the Russian side doesn't know if Polish MiGs handed over to Ukraine will be flown by Ukrainian pilots or Polish pilots, which, of course, if it's Polish pilots, would be a direct interference in the military confrontation on the side of Poland. And many experts also argue such a delivery of military aircraft doesn't make a great difference for Ukraine. Ukraine is not using very much its air force in the current conflict, and having more aircraft available would possibly not change this military strategy of not employing the air force in the full manner.
And the US, of course, had not accepted Poland's offer to deliver the MiG-29s, the Soviet-style fighter jets, which Poland was willing to do. Let me turn now to the unprecedented civilian pain that's being caused by this war. The war in Ukraine is causing the civilian population unprecedented pain, suffering, and death. Many civilians targets have been hit. Millions have fled and are continuing to flee the war zone. As so often happens, Europe, and especially those European countries bordering Ukraine, are bearing the brunt of this unfolding humanitarian crisis. In your opinion, should the US be doing more to support the EU in dealing with this pressing issue?
Well, I do think that the United States should open its borders to Ukrainian refugees. That the burden for the European Union would be much too high if it's only the European Union to take on this problem. Because expectations are that up to 10 million Ukrainians will have fled their country in the next months. So that's definitely something which is difficult for the European Union. Particularly the neighboring states are actually under great pressure, under great strain by these refugees: Poland, Slovakia, Moldova, and Hungary, for instance. So they will have to be redistributed across the European Union, but the United States should be ready to accept a sizable number of Ukrainian refugees as well, unlike what they did in the Syrian case, when so many Syrian Arab migrants came to Europe, and actually the United States closed its borders for these refugees. So this time it should be different, given also the fact of the very strong political and military involvement of the United States in this crisis.
Thank you for that candid answer. The EU also has been hit much harder by the sanctions on Russia than the US, but energy costs are rising globally. Austria's finance minister, Magnus Brunner, has stated that the European Commission's target of replacing 2/3 of Russian gas imports in 2022 is admirable, but not a realistic goal. In your opinion, are these energy goals of the EU realistic? And if yes, how can they be achieved?
Well, if the European Union decides to buy less oil from the Russian side, this would be manageable because oil is a globally traded commodity. So the European Union could diversify its imports of oil, could get more oil from other producers. But if major producers like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or Iran do not step up their production, or in the case of Iran, are allowed to step up its production, then this oil that the European Union would get from alternative sources would not be available for other customers. So it would actually mean an energy crisis for other countries which would have received the oil that in the future the European would have demanded or asked for. I do agree with the Austrian finance minister that this goal of getting rid of 2/3 of gas deliveries to the European Union is absolutely illusionary. That's not possible. Of course, it's possible to diversify away from Russia. Actually, this has been an effort by the European Commission for the past 15 years, but the options are limited. Well, what is indeed doable is to increase LNG imports. Well, actually, over the past 3 months, with a very low flow of Russian gas to the European market, LNG imports have increased already from Qatar, from Nigeria, from Oman, and particularly from the United States. But this has led to a situation where the 25 LNG terminals in EU countries actually are working at a capacity of about 90%. So if the European Union diminishes the volume of gas it buys from the Russian side, there's simply not any capacity left with the current LNG terminals to get imports, to get more imports, to handle more imports of LNG from other countries. So this option is limited. Getting more oil, getting more gas via pipeline is also not very easy to do. Norway is producing at a very high level, and the Norwegian Prime Minister has said they can't produce more in the foreseeable future. So there's no way to have Norwegian gas replacing parts of Russia's gas deliveries, which the European would then not want to buy anymore. More gas from North Africa, from Algeria and Libya is also not available in a great volume, because these countries more and more need the gas that they produce for themselves, for their domestic consumption. And of course, Azerbaijan could somewhat increase its production and deliveries to the European Union. But here we speak about 5 to 10 billion cubic meters, and that's about it. So diversifying away from Russian gas is a very complex task, and it's a long-term task and a very difficult task. So this announcement to get rid of 2/3 of Russian gas deliveries by the end of this year is illusionary. One could say it's simply propaganda. It will not get implemented in reality. What the European Union will have to do also is probably to increase gas production again at the Groningen field in the Netherlands, to have more gas, to more indigenous EU gas. What they will also have to do is to boost energy conservation. They will actually need to increase production of energy by nuclear power plants. Coal-fired power plants, which have already been phased out, will restart producing heat and power. So what this means actually is that the decarbonization efforts of the European Union will seriously be undermined by what would be necessary in the case of blocking Russian gas deliveries to Europe.
So 2 follow-up questions on your answer. Does that mean that Europe's Green Deal is in danger? And second question, would the Iranian JCPOA be an important piece in this puzzle, especially now that the negotiations have actually been put on hold?
Well, the Green Deal obviously cannot be implemented in the way it was defined in that plan, because in such an energy emergency, the European Union simply cannot but use more coal-fired power plants, to use more LNG, which is derived from fracking, particularly the US LNG, with a negative ecological footprint. So yes, the Green Plan would be undermined, but it will happen if the European Union decides that it wants to emancipate itself from Russian energy deliveries, not just oil, gas, but also coal. As regards your second question, well, if the West were to cut, or the European Union were to cut oil deliveries from Russia, or reduce oil imports from Russia, then of course it would be very helpful if other countries start producing more oil, which of course primarily relates to Saudi Arabia, which has a lot of spare capacity. But the Iranian production, of course, is also an issue. If the JCPOA were to be renewed and the sanctions lifted on Iran, the nuclear-related sanctions lifted, including the oils embargo, then Iran would be would be capable of providing more oil to the international markets. However, even if they produce at the maximum level possible, this will not substitute for the whole of Russian oil that will no longer be exported to the European market.
Thank you for that answer. I'd like to turn now to another question, namely, Western media have stated that Putin has not achieved his goals in Ukraine as quickly as he thought he could, and that the Russian military is weak and ineffective. Yet Russian official statements state that everything is going to plan. Which of these 2 statements, in your opinion, is true?
Well, actually, we need to remind ourselves that we are in an information war. So it is perfectly understandable why, for instance, the Ukrainian government publishes very high numbers of Russian fatalities. It is perfectly understandable that the United States and other Western countries are arguing that the Russian military is too weak to actually gain control over Ukraine. So this is part of an information war. which the Russian side, of course, is also involved in. And when Peskov, the press secretary of Putin yesterday, said that everything is going according to plan, this does not necessarily mean that this is the case. And it is definitely not the case because of what we know about the initial military strategy of the Russian side. And the commander of the Russian National Guard has publicly stated that it's not going according to plan. And of course, he has deep knowledge about the military operation. So if he goes online with that message that it's not all going according to the initial plan, then he is definitely right. And of course, Peskov's statement to the contrary is not credible, but is part of Russian propaganda. So indeed, the Russian side most likely has expected to have an easier way of suppressing Ukraine, of gaining control over Ukraine. But that does not mean that the Russian side is not capable of doing so and is not willing to do whatever it is needed in a military sense to achieve this objective of military capitulation if the Ukrainian government is not prepared and willing to accept Russia's political demands.
So a follow-up question to your answer is Putin actually being fully informed of the actual situation on the ground, in your opinion? And what are the current goals of President Putin when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, it's difficult to say, of course, because we don't have any information about the inner circle of the Russian leadership. But it's fair to assume that Putin will not receive all the information about this war. He has, over the past years, decided to actually interact with only a very small group of people, including the Secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, the head of the Domestic Intelligence Service, FSB, Alexander Bortnikov, and the Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. It also includes Yuri Kovalchuk, who is a banker who owns the Bank Rossiya, who is a close friend of Vladimir Putin and actually shares Putin's ideas about Ukraine as part of the Russian world. So it's most likely that this small circle of people is providing Putin only with selective information, not giving him all the information. And with every authoritarian regime, we can assume that people working for the presidency are not willing to actually dispute what Putin says and actually don't deliver negative news to the president. So I do think that Putin is in a particular information space which does not actually give him the full picture of what is the reality on the ground, which of course is very, very risky. And actually this lack of full information, I also consider as one of the reasons why Putin, despite all the costs for Russia, has decided to launch this ground invasion. The political goals are, as stated, a neutral, demilitarized Ukraine, the recognition of Crimea and Sevastopol as Russian, and finally, the recognition of the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk, not in the borders the separatists currently control, but in the much larger territory that makes up the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk in the Ukrainian state structure.
And if he does not achieve these goals, I mean, if President Putin does not achieve these goals, will his position within the Russian Federation as its president be in danger, do you think?
Well, if he doesn't achieve a demilitarized neutrality, demilitarization must not necessarily mean that the Ukrainian side has to disarm completely, dissolve its armed forces. It could also mean that Ukraine accepts that certain weapon systems must not be deployed on Ukrainian territory, and the size of the Ukrainian military would be capped at a certain level. But if Putin does not achieve the neutrality, demilitarized neutrality, then the question, of course, arises: why did he or to put it differently, why did he start this war if he doesn't gain more than he had before the war? So I don't think he can compromise on this demand, and he also cannot compromise on the recognition of the independence of the Donbas republics. If he does, then actually this would be a major military and political defeat for Vladimir Putin, which would undermine his position, not so much with the Russian population, but with the security and military establishment in the Russian Federation. Questions will be asked, of course. Why take all the cost of economic and financial sanctions, all the casualties and the fatalities on the Russian side in this war? A Ukrainian population which is actually hating Russia now, almost all of the Ukrainian population does. What was this for then? So I cannot think about a scenario where the Russian side will give up on these demands, except for a very negative performance of the Russian side in the next weeks and months in the war on the territory of Ukraine. If Russia actually fails militarily, then of course they would have to look for a compromise. If they cannot impose military capitulation, they will need some sort of deal with the Ukrainian government. And well, if they need to do that, then we can certainly say that this was a major defeat for Vladimir Putin, a foreign policy fiasco.
And the sanctions you just mentioned, the EU and US sanctions imposed on Russia have had a huge impact economically on Russia and the Russian population. Do you think the pressure imposed by sanctions will cause a change of heart by President Vladimir Putin to change his goals?
I don't think so. So the deterrence capacity of Western sanctions threats before the war started actually was very limited, or we have to acknowledge it was zero. It was a zero deterrence capability. Putin still decided to go ahead with this ground invasion, despite some of the sanctions being known already before that. According to my information from Russian sources, the Russian leadership was quite surprised about the very early step of excluding several Russian banks from the SWIFT arrangement. They were also surprised that at the very early stage, the Central Bank of Russia was sanctioned. They would have expected in both cases that the German government would have blocked that, or at least would have delayed that. So in this respect, they have been surprised, but not about all the other sanctions. They did not, as some now claim, underestimate the willingness of Western states to a resolute response. They have not actually expected great Western disunity about the sanctions. So they were fully aware of most of the sanctions, but still the Russian leadership decided that the cost for Russia by these sanctions is acceptable for the political and military gains they would achieve by this military aggression. If this calculation will be proven wrong is a question debated very seriously now by Russia watchers and also inside of Russia. But I don't think that even further sanctions like an oil or gas embargo or a full trade embargo would change the position of Vladimir Putin, because that would mean that he finally actually bows to Western pressure. He gets defeated by Western pressure, which is something that Putin will not accept. He has not been trained to lose something, to lose a war.
And the US is also pressuring China to sanction Russia, and China has refused to do this so far. Will China continue to maintain its economic and military position regarding Russia? And what are the implications of the conflict in Ukraine for China and Taiwan?
Well, China, even before the war started, sided with Russia to a certain extent in this common declaration of Xi and Putin at the beginning of February. China agreed that Russian security concerns are legitimate, and they also asked NATO not to expand any further. So in this respect, China has sided politically with the Russian side even before the war. China has also not voted against Russia in the Security Council and the General Assembly of the United Nations, but abstained. But it's difficult for China now because they have close economic relations with both Russia and Ukraine. And actually, their basic principle of foreign policy is that the sovereignty of countries and their territorial integrity must not be violated. So this Russian aggression is a bit tricky for the Chinese side. Expectations that China could be a mediator are not completely wrong, but I'm not very much convinced that this will be the case. I am convinced that Russian expectations that China will come to the aid of Russia, trying to mitigate the impact of Western sanctions, are a bit illusionary. Yes, China will help, as they have done after the sanctions imposed on Russia in 2014. But the message to China has been clear from the United States that if they circumvent sanctions and help Russia economically and financially, there will be serious consequences, which would mean that the United States will impose sanctions on such Chinese companies. If that will happen, I'm not sure, because what will it do to the world economy if there are sanctions both against Russia and China? This would seriously weaken global economic growth or even lead to recession, to a very turbulent situation of the world financial market and the world economy. I think still China is so far the winner of this conflict because for two reasons. First, Russia is now almost completely dependent on China. So it is de facto the junior partner in this alignment between Russia and China. And secondly, the United States will, contrary to their position, have to focus much more on the European continent. They have to be the ultimate guarantor of European security, which will mean that the United States will have to send many more troops to Europe, particularly to the Eastern European NATO countries. It will be a strong financial commitment by the United States to European security. And so the United States will not be able, as they had planned, to focus exclusively on the challenge by China in Asia. So in this respect, China is a winner. As far as Taiwan is concerned, I do not think that a Chinese aggression against Taiwan is now much more likely. Quite to the contrary, China has witnessed what the West is willing to do with Russia. And of course, they are also closely interconnected with the global economy and the global financial market. So China is also vulnerable to Western sanctions. And in case of an aggression of Taiwan, Western sanctions will be definitely imposed. And in addition, unlike in Ukraine, where there is no direct military involvement of the West in the military conflict, in the case of Taiwan, we have this strategic ambiguity on the US side, whether they will come to the defense of Taiwan, which actually over the past years has been less and less ambiguous, but it's more. It has been more clear over the past years that indeed the United States would engage on the Taiwanese side in the case of a military conflict with China if it's not Taiwan that had provoked this military conflict. So I do think that an aggression against Taiwan is less likely than it has been over the past years, despite the fact that Xi wants to be defined in history books as the one who has reunited Chinese lands. But I don't think we will see an aggression on Taiwan in the next years.
Thank you, Professor Mangott, for answering all our questions, answering them candidly and really shedding more light on these very complex and troubling issues which are facing the entire globe today. Thank you for joining iGlobeNews, and thank you for being such a great supporter of iGlobeNews. Thank you, Professor Mangott.